They laughed when she stepped to the microphone. Not a polite chuckle, not a nervous giggle, but a room-filling wave of cruel laughter. In that moment, Dr. Aaliyah Johnson, one of the brightest scientific minds of her generation, wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a keynote speaker. She was, to them, a joke, and she knew why. It wasn't her research they doubted. It wasn't the integrity of her data. It was her. A black woman standing alone on a stage dominated by men who had built their careers in a world that often pretended she didn't belong. The conference banner behind her was bold and impressive, International Biotech Summit 2024. But in that moment, the words seemed meaningless. The laughter wasn't just about one presentation. It was the echo of every locked door she had ever pushed open. Every sideways glance when she walked into a lab. Every time someone told her she was too young, too inexperienced, or too emotional for science at this level. She stood still for a moment, letting the noise wash over her. A lesser person might have walked off stage, taken the next flight home, and disappeared quietly into the shadows. But Aaliyah didn't move. What no one in that audience knew was that in just a few months, she would walk back into their world, not with a presentation, but with a victory so big, so undeniable, that those same men would be forced to clap. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Aaliyah's journey to that stage had not been smooth. Born in a small community in Atlanta, Georgia, she grew up surrounded by love, but not by opportunity. Her parents worked 2 jobs each to keep food on the table. Books were borrowed, clothes were secondhand, and school field trips were a luxury they often couldn't afford. But she had something that no one could take from her, a burning curiosity. While other kids were playing video games, Aaliyah was taking apart old radios, trying to understand the circuits. When other kids were skipping homework, she was staying up late, reading about genetics and molecular biology. She wasn't trying to be better than anyone. She simply couldn't stop asking questions. By the time she was in high school, her science fair projects had already won regional awards. Still, teachers warned her, "Aaliyah, science is competitive. You'll have to be twice as good to get half the credit." She understood what they meant. Her acceptance into a prestigious university came with excitement and a wave of reality. She was one of only 3 black women in her entire molecular biology program. And from the first semester, she noticed the pattern. Her ideas in group discussions were often ignored, only to be repeated by someone else minutes later and suddenly praised. It was exhausting, but she didn't quit. Graduating with honors, she moved into biotech research, focusing on a field that would become her obsession, targeted gene therapy for rare diseases. Her breakthrough work was promising, innovative, and potentially life-changing. But in the corporate academic ecosystem, innovation wasn't enough. You needed credibility, and credibility for people like Aaliyah was often decided in rooms, where she was the only one who looked like her, which brought her to that conference. The place where her humiliation began, the place where her revenge, although she didn't call it that, would be born. The ballroom smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. Rows of white linen tables stretched out before the stage, dotted with neatly printed name cards for professors, CEOs, and industry leaders. Aaliyah stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone. She had rehearsed every line of her presentation for weeks. Her slides were precise, her data bulletproof. The science was there. The proof was there. But she wasn't naive. She knew that in rooms like this, perception often mattered more than proof. Her title slide lit up the massive screen. CRISPR gene editing for rare neurological disorders. A path to accessibility. For a moment, there was silence. Then it happened. A man in the front row, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of person who wore his arrogance like a second skin, leaned toward the colleague beside him and muttered something. They both laughed, loud enough for others to hear. The laughter spread, a ripple through the crowd. It wasn't loud at first, but it was enough to break her concentration. She looked up from her notes, scanning the room. A few people smirked. Others didn't even try to hide their amusement. It was the way they were looking at her, as if she were a misplaced intern who had accidentally wandered onto the main stage. Her palms began to sweat, but she gripped the podium tighter. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, but her voice stayed steady. Midway through her presentation, a man from the middle tables raised his hand. She nodded to him, expecting a question about methodology. Instead, his words cut sharper than any criticism of her work. "Miss Johnson," he began, emphasizing the miss like it was a reminder of her place. "Before you get into all that technical stuff, can you tell us where you actually got your research funding?" The room froze. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was implying she couldn't have possibly secured it on merit. A few chuckles. Someone coughed to hide their laughter. Her throat tightened, but she answered plainly, "Through competitive grants, same as everyone else here." Her voice was calm, but inside she could feel something breaking. She finished the presentation. She hit every point, but she knew they weren't listening to the science. They were listening for a mistake, waiting for something to confirm what they already believed, that she didn't belong. When she stepped off stage, a woman in a navy dress, one of the event coordinators, approached her. "You did well," she whispered. "But you know how these rooms are. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." Those 4 words burned. That night in her hotel room, she replayed every moment in her head. The morning after the conference, the city skyline was still draped in dawn's haze. Aliyah sat at the tiny desk in her hotel room, laptop open, coffee cooling beside her. She hadn't slept much, not from regret, but from clarity. She knew she could never change those men's minds in that ballroom, but she could change the world they operated in. She opened a blank document and typed a single word: Access. That would be the name of her company. Not just because it sounded strong, but because it reflected her mission to give patients with rare diseases access to cutting-edge treatments without the gatekeeping of billion-dollar pharmaceutical giants. The first months were brutal. She sold her car. She cashed out her retirement savings. She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where the hum of dryers was her constant background noise. Every spare moment was spent working, drafting grant proposals, cold emailing investors, building prototypes in borrowed lab spaces. The rejection emails piled up. Some were polite, most weren't. One venture capitalist actually wrote back, "We don't see a viable path forward, and frankly, we're not confident you have the leadership experience for something of this scale." She knew what he meant, even if he didn't say it. Someone like you. But there were moments, small ones, that kept her going. Like the night her prototype successfully corrected a genetic mutation in a lab model for the first time. She sat in the empty lab, staring at the data, realizing she had just proven the impossible was possible. And then came the break. A journalist from a medical innovations blog visited her tiny lab for an interview. He'd heard whispers about a black woman scientist trying to disrupt gene therapy pricing. The article went viral in niche biotech circles. Overnight, her inbox flooded, not just with congratulations, but with meeting requests from mid-tier investors who had previously ignored her. By the end of the year, she had secured $12 million in Series A funding, enough to move into a proper lab, enough to hire a small but brilliant team, enough to turn access from an idea into a real company. Still, she never forgot the faces from that ballroom. And fate had a way of bringing them back into her life, sooner than she expected. One afternoon, her assistant forwarded an invitation to the Global Bioinnovation Gala, the same conference that had mocked her 2 years earlier. Only this time, they weren't asking her to present research. They were asking her to sponsor the event. Her company's name would be on the main banner. Her speech would be the keynote, and the men who had once laughed at her would be in the audience, under her spotlight. The laughter, the tone in that man's voice, the way some of them had looked right through her like she was invisible. She could have let it crush her. She could have decided this world wasn't worth the fight. But instead, she made a decision, one that would change everything. If they thought she didn't belong, she would make herself impossible to ignore, not by asking for their approval, but by building something so undeniable they'd have to acknowledge her, whether they liked it or not. She didn't know it yet, but her next move would set her on a collision course with the very people who had mocked her, and when they crossed paths again, the power dynamic would be completely reversed. The night of the gala, the ballroom was a perfect echo of that night 2 years ago. Glittering chandeliers, soft jazz, and a crowd that measured worth in net worth. But this time, Aaliyah wasn't standing near the back in a borrowed dress. She arrived in a custom deep navy gown, tailored to perfection, the kind of understated elegance that didn't beg for attention. It commanded it. On her arm was Michael Torres, Access's COO and her closest friend from graduate school. The murmurs started almost immediately. Is that her? Wait, isn't she the one from... And then the realization, not pity, not mockery, but recognition. The event host, a silver-haired biotech veteran, greeted her with the kind of warmth reserved for power players. Aaliyah, we're honored to have you as our platinum sponsor this year. When she stepped onto the stage for her keynote, every eye in the room followed her. She took a slow breath, scanning the crowd. And there they were, the same executives who had laughed as she walked out years ago. Now, they sat silent, hands folded, waiting for her words. Her voice was calm, steady. When I stood in this room 2 years ago, I was a guest. I thought I was here to share an idea. Instead, I left, with something far more valuable: clarity. A few people shifted uncomfortably. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. I realized that innovation isn't only about science. It's about access, about removing the walls we build, intentionally or not, that keep the right solutions from the people who need them. Halfway through, she glanced at the front table. One of the former mockers avoided her gaze. Another looked straight at her, his expression unreadable. She ended with a challenge. Access exists because closed doors inspire open revolutions. And if you're not building to include, you're building to exclude. The market will decide which side you're on. The applause was thunderous, not the polite clapping of networking events. Real, sustained applause. Several attendees stood. Cameras flashed. Later that night, she met with the board of one of the largest pharmaceutical firms in the country, the same firm that had once rejected her proposal outright. They were desperate. Their R&D pipeline was stagnant, their public image tarnished. They wanted in on access, and that's when Aaliyah made the move that would cement her legacy. She offered them a partnership, but only if they replaced 3 key executives, all of whom had been present at that first humiliating gala. Within 2 weeks, the deal was signed, and those executives quietly retired. Aaliyah didn't celebrate with champagne or a flashy press conference. Her victory was quieter, sharper, like a door finally swinging shut on a chapter she'd never asked to write. A week after the deal was finalized, she visited her old neighborhood in Baltimore. The streets still held the familiar scent of rain on brick, and the corner store still had the same squeaky door. But now she was there with something to give back. Access launched its first community innovation hub in the very building where she'd studied for her SATs. Rows of computers, 3D printers, and lab equipment lined the space. The sign on the wall read, "Innovation belongs to everyone." Her old high school principal, now retired, visited the hub's opening. "You could have built this anywhere," he said, eyes scanning the crowd of kids exploring the equipment. "I built it here," Aaliyah replied, "because this is where I learned what it's like to be locked out, and I swore I'd never let another door close on someone just because they didn't fit the room's picture." Meanwhile, the story of her rise and the very public firing of those who had mocked her became something of a legend in business circles. Some whispered about her ruthlessness, others admired her resolve. But the truth was simpler. It was never about revenge. It was about balance, about showing that respect isn't optional currency. It's the foundation for collaboration. 2 years later, Forbes named her one of the top 10 most powerful CEOs in the world. When asked in an interview about the gala incident, she smiled slightly. "I don't think about it much," she said, "except when I remember the look on their faces and how it taught me the most important business lesson of my life. Never underestimate the person you're trying to push out of the room. They might own the building next time you see them." In the end, the gala that was supposed to humiliate her became the spark that built a billion-dollar empire and dismantled the very arrogance that had tried to keep her out. Her legacy wasn't the firings. It wasn't the deals. It was the message that echoed long after she was gone. If they don't give you a seat at the table, build your own and make it bigger.